Number 1. I travel pretty regularly, so I don't struggle with anxiety nor anything about flying. I really quite enjoy it. That being said, Flight 72 from New York City to Istanbul in 2012 was easily the scariest experience of my life. We departed from JFK early evening. I wanted to say about 5 or 6, and it was a 10.5-hour flight. A couple of things as background. My plan was to eat the provided dinner, wait a little bit, take the sleeping pills I'd bought, and pass out, and hopefully wake up an hour before landing and avoid all the monotony that goes along with long flights. The other thing to note was that this was not a nice plane. It looked old, it felt old, and rickety, and had that old plane smell. Okay, so everything was going to plan. We were about 3 to 4 hours into the flight. I'd eaten dinner, taken my pills, and was just starting to fade out, when I noticed 2 things. 1. The screens throughout the cabin that depicted the flight path and our current location were off. Last I looked, it had shown us ways off on the coast near the middle of the Atlantic, and it felt like we were periodically dropping altitude. It was odd, because it felt controlled, and it wasn't a big constant drop. Just every few minutes, you could sense that we were being lowered bit by bit, leveling off. This sort of piqued my interest enough to shake off the drowsiness that was coming on. But I wasn't really nervous at this point, just curious as to what was going on. I don't think many people on the plane had any idea about anything unusual. That wasn't until we heard over the intercom, "We need to make an unscheduled landing. Flight attendant, prepare the cabin." That got people's attention. Obviously my first thought was, unscheduled landing? Where? We're in the middle of the Atlantic. I was sitting in the middle of the cabin in the 767 we're in, near where the flight attendant station is, and the jumper seats they sit in, so it was easy for me to lean over and try and chat with one of them. I asked if they had any more information, and knew where we were going to land or what was going on, to which the 2 flight attendants replied that they didn't have any more information than we did at that point. So this sort of quiet anxiety now exists within the cabin. People are chatting quietly between themselves, and everyone is looking around out the windows. It was a clear night, and we were over the Atlantic. All you could see was the ocean. Meanwhile, the screens are still dark, and we are continuing this sort of periodic descent. 10 minutes pass. The captain comes on, and essentially repeats the same message. Still no more information from the flight attendants, and this 10-minute pattern of repeating the same message and the weird descent, with still only the Atlantic to be seen out the window, goes on for another 50 minutes. I had no idea what to assume about all of this. Even the flight attendants seemed anxious, and I even specifically asked them if it was an emergency landing, if the plane was malfunctioning, and they wouldn't confirm or deny anything to me. Let me say here, the flight attendants were phenomenal this whole process, very patient and helpful, and they legitimately did not have the answers we were looking for, and did a wonderful job of keeping everyone calm. That being said, the pilot gets on the line and repeats the message and says we're making an emergency landing, this time sooner than the 10-minute pattern than before. At this point, we couldn't have been more than a few thousand feet above the Atlantic, as our descent had continued this whole time. I didn't have the perspective to see forward, obviously, but on both sides of the plane, all I could see was ocean. There was a palpable anxiety in the cabin, including myself. I always wondered how much that sleeping pill I took helped calm me down, with how high my adrenaline level was. It certainly wasn't helping me sleep at this point. We were getting closer and closer to the ocean, like we were going to land almost. My heart was thumping in my chest. I even got my phone out and was drafting a text to my wife to tell her that I loved her, on the small chance that it would somehow send. Not sure what I was thinking, At the very last moment though, nearing the ground, I see the small light of some fishing boat, and then some lights from land, as then we touch down on land. Everyone clapped and yelled in joy, and let out a huge corporate sigh of relief. The pilot got on and says that there was a malfunction with the plane, and that we had made an emergency landing in Newfoundland in a tiny island called Stevensville. I came to find out later that there had been an electrical malfunction in the cockpit, and that the instrumentation for the pilot was either inaccurate or not on at all, but that he was essentially flying the plane with very limited instrumentation, essentially manual or flying blind. This explains the weird descent pattern that he was doing, bit by bit, as they tried to figure out where to land. The malfunction happened over the Atlantic, and he had the choice between trying to make it to Iceland or turning back and trying Newfoundland, and choosing the latter. I learned that generally they try to plan flight paths across the Atlantic in a sort of arc, in case of situations like this, so the pilot has options. In this case, I'm certainly glad he did. I had a chance to talk to the pilot later on in the evening, but he wouldn't go into much detail about what happened, but I assumed he would have just told me that this was a routine kind of thing. A seasoned pilot probably saved a lot of lives that day, including mine. Beyond all that, what happened over the next 8 to 10 hours is another crazy story. But still, that time with those crazy descents was some of the worst and most terrifying times of my life, and I'm so glad I made it out alive. Number 2. I fly often in Europe, but this was the first time flying in the southern US, having just connected from an easy 9-hour flight from Heathrow. I was on an easier 1-hour flight to Kentucky. The coffee cart had just passed my row when we dropped so far and so fast, I thought I saw tunnels of coffee from all over the rows ahead of me, flying up towards me and hitting the ceiling of the aircraft. What followed was the worst roller coaster ride ever. The coffee cart was flying back, air hostesses gripping the seat, me gripping the passenger next to me. When it evened out, the pilot announced shakily, "Sorry about that, folks. No idea where that came from. More information soon." The passenger sitting next to me still holding my hand, then assured me we'd make it to the ground no matter what, which, when you think about it, isn't really that comforting. Suddenly, the plane goes down, fast, and thrown about like a hairdryer. I am crying as we heavily hit the ground. Pilot returns to say, "We're currently between 2 hurricane fronts, so we need to land as soon as possible." We're the last plane to land. The airport shut, and we didn't leave the runway for 40 minutes as the storm lashed the plane. Lightning fell everywhere. And I kindly asked the passenger sitting next to me why everyone's phones were going off like a siren as soon as they turned on. Hurricanes and planes would not try again. Number 3. June 2015. I was on my way to the airport when we get a call saying all commercial flights are cancelled due to storms over the UK and France. I was one of 10 people on a private plane, so this did not apply to the flight I was on, although it was suggested that the plane did not go. The person who paid for the flight was determined to go, as captains wouldn't agree if it wasn't safe. I made it clear that it was not about the money, as it would be non-refundable if we decided not to go, but I didn't pay and had no real say. Flying to Nice in France is about an hour and a half usually, and we had people waiting for us at the airport for when we were due to land. The first hour was bumpy, but nothing out of the ordinary. The co-pilot comes out and tells us then to be aware we are about to be caught in turbulence and it will be bad. This was scary since they usually downplay it, but what happened next was a 10-seater plane being caught in a lightning storm rolling in every angle. We dropped 5,000 feet. The plane was on its side, rocking and nosediving. The lights went out, rain hit us, and we could see nothing but rain and pitch black, with the occasional lightning strike out the front window. The video that shows how long till the destination went fuzzy, and when it came back it showed that we were not moving forwards. As the wind was so strong, we were being knocked about so much that the plane was practically going at the speed of a train. Everyone is now crying bar the pilot. The co-pilot has his eyes closed and is praying for about 40 seconds until we start to nosedive again. This time the pilot does not reclimb and starts dodging storm clouds. Sky is flashing every few seconds, and I held my ear from the sound of being inside of thunder. This happens for an hour. When we land, the pilot said it was the worst conditions, and that the communications went down midway through, but the company should have never given the okay. The people waiting greeted us with red eyes and open arms. The signal was lost for so long, and conditions were so bad, they were informed that our plane went missing, and that since going off the radar, ground control and whoever else had basically sent out warnings indicating the worst. I used to fly many times a year and never cared for turbulence. Since then, I need sedatives to make it bearable. Even reading this now still haunts me. Number 4. I was flying out of Atlanta because my trip began at 4 AM. I pulled an all-nighter and had been up for well over 24 hours by the time. I was looking forward to getting a couple of hours sleep on board. The gods decide to spit on my plans. Approaching the jetway, my boarding pass scans, beeps once instead of twice, and a slip of paper comes out the scanner. I have a new seat assignment. Cool. No, this would turn out to be very not cool. I get to my seat and there's barely any space left in the overhead. I can't fit my carry-on up there, and my attendant comes to inform me that my bag will have to be left behind in Atlanta and be shipped to me later on. Then a gentleman, a seat back, speaks up and points to space in another overhead. My bag fits. Day saved. I sit down, and in a few minutes or so the plane begins to back away from the runway. At this precise moment, the guy across the aisle from me vomits explosively 3 times. It hits him, the 2 people on either side of him, and the row in front of him for good measure. Everyone around freaks out and starts spamming the call attendant buttons. They shout back that since the airplane has now begun to taxi, nothing can be done until we've reached cruising altitude. The spamming continues, and finally one of the attendants decides to see what everyone is flipping unholy shit about. She walks back, gets one look, and utters, "Oh my god." Across the aisle from this, myself at the window seat and the guy next to me, aisle seat, just had our noses buried in the collars of our coats, trying not to throw up at the point the smell has wafted through the cabin, and we hear a chorus of other people beginning to retch and heave in response. There's nothing for it. The unfortunate puke brigade can't get out of their seats until we reach cruising altitude, so the flight attendant, backed up by a second, try to do what they can until that point. Finally, once we reach cruising, all of them flee to the bathrooms, and the cleanup begins. Except at first they can't find an airspray, so attendant 1 begins spraying vanilla-scented perfume everywhere in an attempt to mask the vomit smell. This did not improve matters. Attendant 2 finds some Febreze and sprays what had to be half a can around the actual seats. People rapidly started complaining of headaches, and my seatmate and I are now completely unable to breathe. Attendant 1 has started biohazard cleanup at this point, sprinkling puke dust everywhere to contain the mess, since it can't be cleaned up fully in mid-air. During this, Attendant 2 catches on that Febreze is killing everyone, So he goes and gets a bag of coffee grounds, which finally remedies the situation. Until someone bitches about the smell of coffee, and they bring the Febreze back, and my seatmate and I die again. We never saw the people who got puked on again, but we saw the puker one more time when he went to get something out of his bag. Beverage service saw the purchase of a metric shit ton of alcohol, and attendant 1 was later joking about burning her uniform. The great pukening was all anyone could talk about for the whole flight. As soon as we landed, phones came out so that everyone could bitch about it to their friends and relatives. No sleep was had on those 2 hours, and my God, was it horrific. Number 5. It's 9/11/2001. I'm flying from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to Cleveland, Idaho. Just as we were about to board the plane, someone in line says something like, "Cessna just crashed into the World Trade Centers." Though a bit troubling, most people were just focused on getting on the plane and didn't pay it much mind. Taxi to runway and take off like normal. I have my head buried in a book, so I'm not really paying much attention to what's going on, though I did notice we didn't get to altitude, which I thought was weird. I think we stayed at around 10,000 feet rather than going up to 30. My flight was direct to Cleveland, and we cruised along about 10,000 feet for about 30 minutes. Then the pilot came over the intercom and said that the FFA had closed all US airspace and that we were landing in Chicago O'Hare. Well, now everyone on the plane is getting nervous. I really had no idea what the hell was going on. Maybe there was a big accident, or maybe a plane was in the air hijacked. We land at O'Hare, and looking out the window, what I could see was chaos. Planes were everywhere, stacked up at the gates, on the access runways, leading to the takeoff runways. I had never seen so many ground planes before. People started getting on their phones, and slowly, information started spreading through the plane that we were under some form of attack. We thought this meant that someone had launched a military attack of some sort, like jet fighter missiles, etc. I'm totally confused as to what the hell is going on. Of course, my cell phone was dead, but it probably wouldn't have mattered if it were charged, because people were having a difficult time getting through to their loved ones via the telephone anyway. After about an hour of waiting, we were able to get off the gate. The scene inside was total panic. I remember seeing National Guard soldiers there with their rifles and dogs. Over the intercom, they were repeating, "Please leave Chicago O'Hare Airport as soon as possible." I overheard people saying that the attack was coming to Chicago. I have 2 small kids at home and a wife. I'm stuck at O'Hare with what I thought at the time was an imminent attack. I left my luggage behind and got out of the front of the airport. I managed to stop a guy driving a rental car shuttle bus and asked if he knew if there were any cars available. He said, "Buddy, nothing is available, but I hop on and I'll take you with me so you're not stuck here." I ride to the rental car facility and I'm racking my brain to try and figure out how to get the hell out of Chicago, with no rental cars available. Flights are shut down, and I was sure trains wouldn't be an option either. Then it hit me. I knew what to do. I asked the rental car driver for some directions on where I needed to go and started walking. I walked for about 20 to 30 minutes or so, and found what I was looking for. U-Haul. I rented a U-Haul truck and drove all the way back to Ohio. As you can imagine, it was absolutely horrific to go through. Number 6. I was working a flight from London Heathrow to Singapore. The second I greeted this couple at the doors, I knew there were going to be trouble. I know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but hey, I'm only human, and I'd been doing this job long enough to know an asshole when I saw one. The guy was 50-ish and chronically obese with a t-shirt that ended at his belly button, and he waddled up to the door. You could see his belly flopping from side to side, as if it had a life of its own. He was the kind of guy that you could smell before you see him coming. His wife was short, and seemed kind of whacked out. The second they got to the doors to board, the woman started asking when food was going to be served and that she wanted a bottle of water for both of them. I got her the water and, in the least patronizing way possible, said that food would be served after takeoff. I was working in the business section, and there was no way that these two were going to be my problem. Remember what I said about not judging a book by its cover? Well, it turns out they were in business class with me for 13 hours. As soon as he sat down, he wasted no time in taking off his flip-flops, and before I knew it, his wife was on her knees cutting his skanky toenails and leaving that sweet debris all over the floor. Fast forward to meal service, and I asked them what they'd like. He wants beef, she wants pasta. I go back to the gallery and come back with pasta, but she's gone to the toilet. Fine. I'll leave it on her tray and let her husband know it's there for her. I go back to the gallery and get the beef, and come back, and he is eating his wife's food. I didn't know what to do and assumed they'd already discussed it or something and thought nothing of it, leaving the food there with him. 30 minutes later, and the woman is brought up by another crew member. Apparently she got lost on a plane and couldn't find her way back. Seriously? Next thing I know, she was complaining to another flight attendant that her food had been forgotten. I said to her that her husband had eaten it, and he denied it, and by that point all the plates had been cleared, so there was no evidence. Not only that, we'd run out of pasta, which of course she was very displeased by. Over the next few hours, we had complaints from passengers saying that the guy was burping, farting, and otherwise being really gross. Sadly, there wasn't much we could do as it was a full flight and we couldn't exactly move anyone around. At that point, I walked down the aisle and he was standing on his seat looking down at the sleeping passenger next to him. Perversely. Literally just frozen there. I asked him if he was okay, and he said that he needed to use the toilet, but couldn't get past the passenger next to him. His look had a completely different meaning to it, so I asked the passenger if he could move his legs. The passenger did so, and this guy still manages to trip over him and nearly crush and smother this guy to death with his BO. He was in the toilet so long, I nearly had to knock on the door to see if he was okay. I don't know about you, but 45 minutes certainly seems excessive to me. Once he came out, he said he needed painkillers for his back. I said we could give him paracetamol or Tamgestic if the pain was really bad. And at this point, he took out a packet of empty painkillers that were very strong and said that he needed those exact ones, the ones that he was prescribed by his doctor and provided by his pharmacy. I explained to him that we weren't a pharmacy and obviously didn't have any on board. He was having none of it and complained to the head air hostess. After all of this shit, I was beginning to wonder why I took up the job, and at that moment I heard a scream from the cabin. He had completely undressed himself and was walking stark naked down the cabin. His wife had once again disappeared and was lost, and in the end they were escorted off the plane by the police in Singapore. As it turns out, they were off their tits on meds and booze. Not a day I would ever wish to relive.